You read their name all the time in the New Testament. The Pharisees. They almost always show up as the bad guys. They're the ones questioning Jesus, trying to trap him, and eventually calling for his death. It's easy to just file them away as the villains and move on. But it's not that simple. If we want to understand Jesus, we have to understand the world he lived in. And the Pharisees were a huge part of that world. They weren't just a random group of grumpy old men. They were a powerful, influential, and in many ways, a sincere religious movement. They thought they were doing the right thing. They believed they were protecting God's law and God's people. And that's what makes the story so much more interesting and so much more tragic. Jesus' conflict with them wasn't a simple case of good versus evil. It was a clash between two very different ideas of what it means to know God, to please God, and to live for God. To understand why Jesus disliked them, or more accurately, why he so fiercely opposed their system, we first have to understand who they were. Let's go back a few hundred years before Jesus was born. The Jewish people were in a tough spot. They were living under the control of foreign empires. One of these was the Greek Empire, led by successors of Alexander the Great. The Greeks had a powerful and attractive culture. They had philosophy, gymnasiums, art, and a different way of looking at the world. This culture, called Hellenism, started to seep into Jewish life. Some Jewish people were fine with this. They adopted Greek names, spoke the Greek language, and embraced Greek customs. But others were horrified. They saw this as a betrayal of their identity. They believed that to be God's chosen people meant being separate, distinct, and holy. They believed that following God's law, the Torah, was the only thing that kept them from being swallowed up by the pagan world around them. This tension eventually exploded into a war, the Maccabean Revolt. It was a fight for Jewish independence and religious freedom. Out of this fiery period of history, several groups emerged, each with a different idea of how to be a faithful Jew in a hostile world. One of those groups was the Pharisees. The name Pharisee likely comes from a Hebrew word meaning to separate. And that's exactly what they were about. They were the separatists. They wanted to build a wall, a spiritual fence, to protect Jewish life from outside corruption. Their goal was noble. They wanted to help everyday people be faithful to God in every part of their lives, not just in the temple. They wanted to bring holiness out of the sanctuary and into the home, the marketplace, and the farm. Unlike another major group, the Sadducees, the Pharisees weren't mostly priests or wealthy aristocrats. The Sadducees were the establishment, the old money families who controlled the temple in Jerusalem. They were more politically connected and more willing to compromise with Roman rulers to keep the peace. The Pharisees were more of a grassroots movement. They were laymen, scholars, scribes. They were the teachers in the local synagogues. They were respected by the common people because they took the law seriously. They were the religious experts the average person would turn to for guidance. Their beliefs also set them apart. The Sadducees were very conservative in their theology. They only accepted the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah, as scripture. They didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead, or in angels or spirits. The Pharisees believed in all of those things. They accepted a wider range of scriptures, and they believed that after death, there would be a judgment and a resurrection of the righteous. In this respect, Jesus and the early Christians were actually much closer in belief to the Pharisees than to the Sadducees. The Apostle Paul himself, before his conversion, was a Pharisee, and a very zealous one at that. He says so himself. This tells you they weren't just a bunch of lazy hypocrites. They were passionate, dedicated, and deeply committed to their faith. So, if they were so zealous for God and his law, where did the conflict with Jesus come from? The problem wasn't their desire to be holy. The problem was how they tried to achieve it. The centerpiece of Pharisaic belief was something called the oral law, or the tradition of the elders. They believed that when God gave Moses the written law in Mount Sinai, he also gave him a set of oral explanations to go along with it. These explanations were passed down through generations of teachers. The purpose of this oral law was to be a fence around the Torah. The idea was this: God's law is perfect and sacred. To make sure nobody ever breaks it, not even by accident, we need to build a set of extra rules around it. For example, the Torah says, do not work on the Sabbath. That's a clear command. But what exactly counts as work? Can you carry something? If so, how heavy? Can you tie a knot? If so, what kind of knot? Can you cook? Can you heal someone? The Pharisees and their scribes spent centuries debating these questions and creating an incredibly detailed system of rules and regulations for every imaginable situation. Their intention was good, They wanted to make the law practical for daily life and prevent anyone from even getting close to breaking one of God's commands. But here's where the problem started. Over time, this fence of man-made rules became more important than the law it was meant to protect. The traditions of men began to overshadow the commands of God, and this is the first major point of conflict Jesus had with them. We see this clash very clearly in the Gospel of Mark. Some Pharisees see Jesus' disciples eating food without first performing a ceremonial hand-washing. This wasn't about hygiene, it was one of their oral traditions for maintaining ritual purity. They confront Jesus about it. Jesus' response is explosive. He doesn't just defend his disciples. He attacks the very foundation of the Pharisees' system. He quotes the prophet Isaiah, calling them hypocrites who honor God with their lips, but whose hearts are far from him. Then he says it directly, you have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions. He gives a powerful example. God's law says, honor your father and mother. This includes taking care of them in their old age. But the Pharisees had a tradition called korban. A person could declare that their money or property was korban, meaning it was a gift dedicated to God. According to their tradition, once you did that, you were no longer obligated to use that money to help your parents, even if they were starving. You could effectively use a religious loophole to get out of one of God's most basic commands. And Jesus was furious. He showed how their man-made tradition directly canceled out God's clear command. The fence they built to protect the law was now being used as a way to avoid it. They had become so focused on their own religious system, their own rules and interpretations, that they had lost sight of the very heart of God. They were majoring in the minors. This leads to the second and perhaps most famous criticism Jesus leveled against them: hypocrisy. The word hypocrite in Greek originally referred to an actor on a stage. It meant someone playing a part wearing a mask. When Jesus called the Pharisees hypocrites, he wasn't just saying they failed to practice what they preached. He was saying their entire religious life was a performance for an audience. They were actors playing the part of righteous men. He saw that their religion was focused on external appearances. They made sure they looked holy on the outside. They would pray in public, on street corners, so everyone could see how devout they were. They made a big show of giving money to the poor. They wore special religious clothing to signal their piety. They were meticulous about the small things, like tithing 1/10 of their garden herbs, mint, dill, and cumin. Jesus didn't condemn praying or giving or tithing. He condemned doing these things for show. He said they did it all to be seen by others. He saw right through the performance to the heart. And what he saw was a heart full of pride, greed, and self-righteousness. His most scathing description of this is in the Gospel of Matthew, where he says they are like whitewashed tombs. On the outside, they look beautiful, clean, and respectable. But on the inside, they are full of death, decay, and corruption. The image is brutal, but it gets to the core of the problem. Their righteousness was only skin deep. It was a paint job, not a deep-down change. They focused on tithing tiny spices, but, as Jesus said, they neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. They would strain a gnat out of their wine to avoid accidentally swallowing an unclean insect, but they would swallow a camel, a metaphor for ignoring huge moral failings. They were so obsessed with the fine print of their religious code that they missed the whole point. The point wasn't to be an expert rule keeper. The point was to love God and to love people. Their system had failed to produce that love. Instead, it produced pride. This brings us to a third major point of conflict to their view of people. The Pharisee system was by its very nature a system of separation and exclusion. To be pure, you had to stay away from anything and anyone considered impure. This included non-Jews, Gentiles, but it also included many of their own people. They looked down on tax collectors who were seen as traitors working for the Romans. They shunned sinners, a broad category that could include anyone who didn't follow the Pharisaic rules: prostitutes, the irreligious, and even the common, uneducated people who couldn't possibly keep up with all the complex regulations. In their minds, these people were spiritually contaminated. To associate with them was to risk becoming contaminated yourself. Theirs was a holiness by separation model. Then Jesus comes along. And what does he do? He does the exact opposite. He actively seeks out the people the Pharisees avoided. He eats with tax collectors and sinners. This was deeply shocking in their culture. Sharing a meal was a sign of acceptance, of fellowship. Okay? For a rabbi, a holy teacher, to eat with outcasts was a scandal. The Pharisees couldn't understand it. They grumbled. This man welcomes sinners and eats with them. Their question was, if you're from God, why are you hanging out with the wrong people? Jesus' answer came in parables, like the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the prodigal son. He was showing them what God is really like. God isn't a God who sits back and waits for people to get clean enough to approach him. He is a God who actively seeks and saves the lost. He is a shepherd who leaves the 99 safe sheep to go find the one that has strayed. He is a father who runs to embrace his rebellious son while he is still a long way off. This was a fundamental reversal of the Pharisaic worldview. They saw righteousness as a status to be achieved and protected, and Jesus presented righteousness as a gift to be received, especially by those who knew they didn't deserve it. The Pharisees saw their job as keeping the righteous separate from the sinners, but Jesus saw his mission as calling sinners to repentance. He said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." For the Pharisees, their system was about creating a clear line between what's the clean, the righteous, the insiders, and them, the unclean, the sinners, the outsiders. Jesus came and erased that line. He showed that God's love and grace were for everyone, especially for those who were broken, marginalized, and written off by the religious elite. A fourth area of constant battle was the Sabbath. The command to rest on the seventh day was one of the 10 Commandments. It was a cornerstone of Jewish identity. For the Pharisees, protecting the Sabbath meant defining exactly what was and wasn't allowed. Their oral traditions had created a list of 39 categories of forbidden work. This led to endless, complex debates. For example, healing someone was considered work unless their life was in immediate danger. Again and again we see Jesus clashing with them over this. He heals a man with a withered hand in the synagogue on the Sabbath. He heals a woman who had been crippled for 18 years. He tells a man he has just healed to pick up his mat and walk, which the Pharisees considered illegal carrying. Every time the Pharisees are enraged, they see him as a lawbreaker, a dangerous radical who is undermining the very law of God. But Jesus wasn't trying to abolish the Sabbath. He was trying to restore it to its original purpose. He asks them pointed questions they can't answer. If one of you has a sheep, and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? He was exposing their inconsistent and heartless application of their own rules. They would make an exception for their property, but not for a human being in need. His most profound statement on the matter was this: the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. This turned their whole system on its head. They saw people as existing to serve the rules of the Sabbath. Jesus taught that the Sabbath was a gift from God for people, for their rest, for their good, for their restoration. Healing someone wasn't a violation of the Sabbath, it was a fulfillment of its purpose. Showing mercy and doing good were always permissible. They had turned a gift of rest into a heavy burden of oppressive regulations. Jesus was lifting that burden. He was showing that God cares more about compassion for people than about the meticulous observance of religious rules. All these conflicts over tradition, hypocrisy, inclusion, and the Sabbath point to one central underlying issue: the question of authority. The Pharisees' authority came from their tradition, from the long line of rabbis who had interpreted the law before them. They would say, "Rabbi so-and-so taught this," or "the elders have said that." Their whole system was based on this chain of human interpretation. Jesus arrived on the scene and taught with a completely different kind of authority. The Gospels say that the people were amazed because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. He didn't quote other rabbis, he just spoke. He would say, "You have heard that it was said, but I say to you." This was an astonishing claim. He was placing his own word on the same level as, or even above, the revered traditions and even the written law itself. He was claiming to be the ultimate interpreter of God's will. When he forgave sins, something only God could do, they accused him of blasphemy. When he declared all foods clean, he single-handedly set aside a core part of the Mosaic law. This was the ultimate challenge. The conflict wasn't just about hand-washing or the Sabbath. It was about who had the right to speak for God. The Pharisees believed that right belonged to them and their system of tradition. Jesus claimed that right for himself directly. There could be no compromise between these two positions. One had to be right, and the other had to be wrong. This is why their opposition to him grew from suspicion to outright hatred. He wasn't just a rival teacher with a different interpretation. He was a threat to their entire religious structure, their social standing, and their source of authority. By healing people, loving outcasts, and teaching with divine power, he was demonstrating that God was at work through him in a way that bypassed their entire system. He was showing people a direct path to God that didn't require the Pharisees as gatekeepers. And this is what culminates in the famous chapter of Matthew 23, where Jesus unleashes a series of woes upon the Pharisees. It's a devastating public critique. He calls them blind guides who lead people astray. He says they shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. Their system, which was supposed to help people get to God, was actually becoming a barrier, preventing them from finding him. He condemns them for creating heavy, cumbersome loads of religious rules and placing them on people's shoulders, while they themselves would not lift a finger to move them. Their religion had become a burden, not a joy. It was about control and performance, not freedom and grace. They were so focused on the external details that they had become blind to the reality of God standing right in front of them in the person of Jesus. So, when we ask why Jesus disliked the Pharisees, it's not that he had a personal vendetta against every individual member of the group. We know there were some who were open-minded, like Nicodemus, who came to Jesus by night to ask sincere questions. Gamaliel, a respected Pharisee, later urged caution in persecuting the early Christians. So, it wasn't about the people as much as it was about the system they represented and promoted. And Jesus opposed their system because it elevated human traditions above God's commands. It prized external appearance over internal reality. It produced pride and judgment instead of humility and mercy. It excluded the very people God was seeking. It turned God's gifts into heavy burdens. And it blinded people to the true work of God in their midst. It was a religion of the letter that had killed the spirit of the law. After Jesus' death and resurrection, and especially after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 AD, the Sadducees, whose power was tied to the temple, faded away. It was the Pharisees' way of thinking that survived. Their focus on scripture, interpretation, and life centered in the synagogue, and home allowed Judaism to adapt and endure. Modern rabbinic Judaism is in many ways the spiritual descendant of the Pharisees. This shows the strength and resilience of their approach, but the warnings of Jesus remain timeless. His conflict with the Pharisees isn't just an ancient historical debate. It's a warning to all religious people in all times and places. It's a warning against letting our traditions, no matter how well-intentioned, become more important than God himself. It's a warning against the kind of religion that looks good on the outside but is hollow on the inside. It's a warning against ever believing that our religious performance makes us better than others or earns us God's favor. And it's a warning against building walls of exclusion when God is trying to build bridges of grace. The story of Jesus and the Pharisees is a call to constantly check our own hearts. Are we more concerned with being right than with being loving? Are we more focused on our rules than on people? Is our faith a source of freedom and life, or a heavy burden for ourselves and others? They were sincere, passionate, and devout. They got a lot of things right, but in the end they missed the most important thing. They missed him, and that's the real tragedy.